Hello, how are you? Happy Friday. I'm Andrea. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, today's Friday, and that's awesome. Actually, it might be Saturday where you are, which is even better. We actually have I guess it's a slang or like a common phrase or a common word that we use for Friday. We call it Fry-yay. So I hope you're having a good Friday. I am, so far. So this lesson is a lesson that I want to teach you because I have heard some of my closest friends who are not from an English-speaking country and some of my best and brightest students who are not from an English-speaking country make mistakes with this all the time. And it's a really easy fix. All you have to do is kind of be aware of it. And part of the reason is that it's a cultural thing as well as a grammar language thing. And what I'm talking about is formal and informal language and the difference between the two. And then we're also going to talk about how to make polite requests in English. And that's where I've heard friends make mistakes and it's not so that it's so awful, but it's a very small change that you can make in your spoken English in particular that will really make a difference with people, whether it's work or school or travel or whatever it is. It will really make a difference in your, I think, in your relationships and how people see you with your English. Okay? So first, let's talk about formal and informal language in English. One of the big differences with English is that, unlike other languages, we don't have a formal system of formal and informal language. For example, in other languages like Spanish, they have a pronoun that they use, usted, for singular people that you're showing respect to. They also have ustedes, which is a plural form of people that you're showing respect to. French has vous, which is similar. In English, we don't have a specific pronoun to represent a person that we're trying to show respect to, and so therefore we're speaking formally to. We just have you. And you could be anybody. You could be your neighbor, you could be your best friend, you could be your teacher, you could be your boss, you could be the president, but you could be you, and it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really communicate any kind of formality or politeness. So we have to rely on our grammar, and we have to rely on our word choice to express, to communicate formality or politeness. Okay, so that's kind of one of the differences when you're thinking about this. You have to remember we don't have a vous, we don't have an usted, we just have you. So it's our language and our word choice that communicates that politeness or that formality. Okay, so first let's talk about formal language. These are some kind of general rules for formal language in English. You'll see maybe things different. I'm going to talk about some exceptions. But this is pretty much where and when you'll see formal language. So formal language is also referred to as polite language, yeah? And you'll mostly see it written. So whether you're reading a newspaper article, an actual newspaper, or you're reading it online, if you're reading something for school, like a journal or something like that, that is more academic, more formal, business dealings sometimes. Again, it depends on the relationship with the person that you're working with. If it's the CEO, then you're going to want to write an email that's more formal, almost like a letter. Emails used to be written like letters. Now it's just like, a line or two. But in written language, generally speaking, you will see more formal grammar and more formal language. The one exception is social media. I'm sure you have seen text messages and Facebook and Twitter and all kinds of stuff where, Y-O-U is spelled you, and there's short, and in your language too, I'm sure. There's shortened versions of words, abbreviations that mean things. So this is the exception. Social media is the exception for written language. Social media is actually probably in some cases, the most informal way you can communicate to someone. So just keep that in mind. It really depends on your audience, who you're writing to. Okay. Also, formal language usually involves the long form of a word. So we don't use contractions too much. Again, it depends, but you'll see more things like she is, the long form, versus she's, the contraction. This is more informal, and this is more formal. Okay? Passive voice, like the movie was directed by Steven Spielberg. Passive voice sometimes is more formal because it creates more distance. The more distance you can create between you and the audience through passive voice, for example, or through indirect language, this makes it more formal. And even here in the United States, we are not nearly as formal as our cousins are in the UK. We're kind of, the revolutionaries historically, and so we've kind of changed the language a little bit, same as in Australia and Canada as well, other countries that speak English. Our English is different from the UK. And the pure British English, the Queen's English, is extremely formal. So our version here in the United States is even less, so just so you're aware of that. Okay? So these are some examples of when or how you'll see formal language. Informal language is more spoken. And that's because it's more spontaneous. It's just sort of happening in the moment, right? So the way that I teach a class, for example, is probably a little bit more on the informal side, especially depending on my students and my relationship with them. Formal may be more on the first day, but after that it becomes more informal. So spoken language, this is when you hear friends talking to each other. Maybe you'll overhear a conversation and be like, what are they talking about? And it's probably because they're using lots of phrasal verbs. Everybody hates phrasal verbs. Lots of phrasal verbs and lots of slang. And slang is difficult because it can be very regional. The slang that they use in the UK, for example, or Australia, or even in Canada, is different from the slang we use here in the United States. And slang in the United States even can be regional. The way that people talk in New York is different from the way they talk in Los Angeles, the words that they use in regard to slang. Some of it, no. Some of it, everybody understands. But it can also be very specific to where you are or where you're from. So just be aware of that, okay? So if you hear slang, it's an informal conversation. Phrasal verbs, again, also are very informal. Phrasal verbs all have a definition that's longer, right? Like get is really receive, okay? So if you're going to use a phrasal verb with get, make sure that you always understand get has the most phrasal verbs of any verb. Make sure you understand the definition because that will help you with your formal language as well as your informal language because they're synonyms, right? Okay, so moving on into polite requests. So now you understand, formal language in English is kind of specific to written and it's more academic, more business oriented. It really depends on, who your audience is. Informal language is more between friends, and it's more spoken, it's more casual. I know I've worked with business people in the United States, and they have told me that it's confusing for them sometimes working here in the United States because they don't understand the formality system because we call our bosses by their first name. But when we ask them to help us, we request a favor or something, we use more formal language usually. So don't get too confused by that if you happen to work with Americans. It can be a little bit confusing sometimes, but if you just kind of follow along with other people, you'll get an idea of how you should act and what's appropriate, okay? So now that you have an understanding of formal and informal, we're going to talk about making polite requests. And this is where I have heard friends of mine make mistakes and it just sounds so rude, basically. And it's only because they're translating from their language into English. So, for example, if instead of asking a nice, polite request for something, they use the imperative, like, help me or give me or, something like that. And we don't do that in English, okay? The imperative in English, go or do or make or stop, whatever, it sounds very aggressive, or it can sound very aggressive. And that aggression can sound kind of rude, like, give me that. It sounds like mean, actually, as opposed to, could you give me that, please? Right? That's where we're going. So when we make requests in English, we're basically, a request is asking for something. I'll move over here. Okay? You're asking for something. So when you ask someone for something, you want to be nice about it, right? You don't want to be mean. You don't want to say, give me that. You want to say, could you give that to me, please? Right? You want to be nice about it because you're asking for help. You're asking for information, maybe. You're asking for a favor. But when you request something, you're asking for someone to do something for you. So you want to be nice, okay? And there are 5 different ways to be nice when you're asking for something. So first, we have, would you help me? And would is considered formal or polite. We also have, could you help me? Would and could are the same. There's really no difference in meaning. Okay? So these are both formal ways of asking someone for help. Could you help me? Would you help me? Another third way, and this is probably the most formal way that you could request something from someone, would be, would you mind helping me? Okay, and this, as you can see, there are more words here, so it kind of creates more distance between you and the listener. Make sure that you put the gerund form of the verb after mind. So, would you mind helping me? Would you mind telling me? Would you mind driving me? Whatever it is, it doesn't matter the verb, but it should always be the gerund after would you mind. Okay? So these are 3 polite ways of making a request. So these are questions maybe you would ask your boss, your professor, or your teacher, a mentor, someone that you want to show respect and formality to, okay? And then for the informal, or what we call direct way, more direct way, would be simply, will you help me? Or can you help me? So this language is reserved more for friends, coworkers, people that you have an informal relationship to, or an informal relationship with, excuse me. So you could just say, hey man, will you help me for a second? As opposed to, would you help me? I'm having some trouble. Okay? So would is formal, will is informal, could is formal, can is informal, and then would you mind is kind of on its own, and it's the most formal way that you could ask something from someone, okay? So, lastly, if you are not sure, you're in a new situation, you're at a party or a meeting or something, and you're not really sure what you should do, should you be more formal, should you be less formal, how should you act, how should you talk? If you're unsure, here are 2 things that you can do. The first thing is pay attention to others. Follow their lead. So if you see other people acting more formal or speaking more formally, then you should too. But if you see other people acting maybe a little bit more informal, then it's probably okay to, say, hey, what's up? As opposed to, hello, how are you? Right? So just watch what other people around you are doing to try and get an idea of how you should act. And the second is, if you're still unsure, if you don't understand the conversations people are having, or you're just not sure, it's always better to side with formal. And why do I say that? Because it's a lot easier to go from formal language to informal language than it is to go from informal back up to formal. Okay? So if you, for example, are meeting someone for the first time, your boyfriend or girlfriend's parents, let's say, it's better to say, hello, how are you? It's very nice to meet you, as opposed to, hey man, what's up? How you doing? Right? The way you might say, how are you to a friend. So it's always better to side on formal. And then as the relationship grows, or if the person says to you, oh, it's okay, you don't have to call me Mr. Jones or whatever, then you know, oh, okay, I can relax a little bit. But if you go into it super relaxed, it's hard to go back to formal. Okay? So that would be my advice for that. Secondly, we say please and thank you a lot in English. Like a lot. And even in the United States, where we're not as formal as they are in other countries, we say please and thank you a lot. We're just kind of trained. To the point where when I was living in Barcelona, I had a friend who once said to me, Andrea, sin por favor, which means, Andrea, without please. You don't have to say please to me all the time. We're friends. And I was like, but Belen, in English we say, hey, can you give me that please? Or can I have your phone number please? Or we say please all the time and thank you. And I was guilty of translating from English into Spanish how I would say to a friend, can you do me a favor? And she corrected me and said, you don't have to say please all the time. We don't do that here, And I was like, okay. So I was guilty of making the mistake of being too formal with my friends in another language. So please is something that we do say a lot in American English, and in all Englishes, I'm pretty sure. And please can go in two places, okay? The easiest is simply to put it at the end of the sentence. So for example, could, the formal, right? Could you help me, please? And you'll notice that there's a comma here. So could you help me, please? Okay? The second place that you can put it is before the main verb. So it doesn't matter what the main verb is. In this sentence, for example, the main verb is help, but it could be anything, right? So you want to put please in front of the main verb. So for example, could you please help me? So these are the two ways that you can incorporate please into your polite request, either at the end of the question or before the main verb, to make it even sound more formal. And you can use please with will and can with your friends too. It's not just reserved for formal language. But it makes it sound even more formal if you're trying to be really formal with someone by adding please to the question. Okay, so I hope that helps when you're working or studying or just living your life and you want to ask someone to help you with something, you want to ask them for information, whatever it is, you're requesting something. Make sure you use would, could, can, or will. Don't just say, give me that, or tell me. Even though you're not trying to be rude, maybe you are, I don't know. But if you're not trying to be rude, to our ears, our English-speaking ears, or our English listening ears, to us it sounds rude and mean and, So just be aware of that, okay? And try to incorporate these questions, would, will, could, can, and would you mind? I had to think for a second there. Trying to incorporate these 5 questions, actually, when asking for requests, okay? Because it really will, if you're, say for example, you're working with Americans or Brits or something, and you said, would you mind helping me with something? You'll notice maybe their reaction would be a little bit different. Like they might be more like, sure, okay, as opposed to you saying, help me with this, and then being like, okay, right? It's for us, it matters, okay? As English speakers, it really does make a difference. We understand if you're not a native English speaker that you might be making mistakes because you are translating from your native language. That's fine. But it just sounds a lot better to our ears if you use these guys, the polite requests. And they're not hard. Can, could, will, would. You've known those for years, right? Okay, awesome. Well, I hope you guys have a great weekend. Whatever it is you're doing, stay safe, be happy, and in considering everything that's been going on in our world lately, tell those who you love just how much you love them. I know I'm going to. Have a good one, guys.